Ethan Rodgers was plunged into a difficult and miserable life right from the very moment he was born. Sure, the young man had never seen his parents before and had spent his childhood in an orphanage, but that wasn't the worst of it. By the evil irony of fate, Ethan was born mute. This caused his parents to panic, to say the least. The first to act was his mother, who hadn't heard a single sound escape his lips since the moment her son was born. His mother was distraught with the shock of childbirth, but his father, her husband, supported her decision, and thus they agreed to leave their newborn son at an orphanage. All that being said, Ethan had no other medical issues apart from his speech impediment. By abandoning their son, his parents had pretty much sealed their unhappy orphan's fate for many years to come. Since Ethan was mute, he had to study in a special group for children with speech problems. The boy had to learn sign language, which became his main form of communication. Unfortunately, young children are known for their cruelty and their ability to hurt those who are even a little bit different. Thus, Ethan had no choice but to use his fists to prove himself from an early age. Over time, the other orphan kids got used to the mute boy, who spoke only in gestures and wouldn't utter a single word. Time flew by quickly within the orphanage walls, and Ethan, like most orphans his age, wasn't ready for the hostile adult world. While Ethan did manage to secure a small house on the outskirts of Chicago, finding a job proved to be very difficult for him. Many employers had little interest in hiring a mute orphan, with no work experience and no references. Enduring rejection after rejection, Ethan never despaired and kept looking for work. With time, luck smiled upon the determined young man, or rather, the construction store owner did. Thus, he was hired as a loader. Having finally gotten his first job, Ethan was on cloud 9. He naively believed that now he would finally live life in wealth and luxury. His first salary crushed all of his rosy dreams. The money he earned was barely enough to buy food and some basic clothes. Ethan didn't let this get to him though, and kept on working. He had to learn to make do with very little from very early in his life. At this point of Ethan's life, he had yet to meet someone near and dear to his heart. He first fell in love at the age of 30 when he met a beautiful woman. Her name was Pamela, and he met her on the street by pure chance. To Ethan's surprise, Pamela approached him first and asked him where the nearest post office was. For obvious reasons, Ethan couldn't reply. He just pointed in the direction with his hand. She looked at Ethan carefully and then nodded understandingly. "I assume you can't talk, right?" Pamela was quick to ask. Ethan smiled, his cheeks flushing. He nodded his head eagerly. "My name's Pamela. I'm new to Chicago. And you must be local, is that so?" She continued her one-sided conversation. Ethan nodded again, which earned an approving smile from Pamela. Ethan was naturally very naive and gullible. Because of this, he couldn't have possibly known that he was standing face to face with a very clever con artist who had her sights set on his home. The truth was that Pamela was just pretending not to know anything about Ethan. The sly beauty was already well aware that Ethan lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of the city. That's why she asked to stay overnight at his place, pretending to be an innocent tourist. As a kind and trusting man, Ethan couldn't refuse, and this put him in danger. Pamela behaved nicely at first. She didn't show her true nature until later. She prepared delicious breakfasts, lunches, and dinners for Ethan, giving him hope for a future together. Ethan thought he'd found true love, one he had only seen in books or Hollywood movies. Unfortunately, the truth was far more unpleasant than he could have ever imagined. One day, Ethan came home from work and found 3 strange men in his house. They used tape measures to measure the rooms of the house and logged their findings in notebooks. Meanwhile, Pamela was acting as if she owned the place, talking about the advantages of living in the area. Ethan watched her curiously. That night, Ethan tried to find out what was going on, but Pamela didn't let him, choosing to distract him with a nice evening instead. That was his last night with Pamela. The next morning, he was thrown out onto the street. It was Pamela's new acquaintances that threw him out. They turned out to be criminals involved in housing scams. Of course, Ethan tried to put up a fight, but he didn't get the justice he wanted. Instead, he was beaten up, taken to the outskirts of the city, and left there without any documents. It's hard to say how he even managed to survive. God must have taken pity on the mute orphan and gave him a second chance. Since that day, Ethan had lived on the streets, going from one cheap shelter to another. Despite all his attempts to go to the police, he couldn't get far without his papers, especially with Pamela having already sold Ethan's cabin before vanishing completely. In order to earn a living, Ethan was forced to collect cardboard and glassware and turn it at collection points. Time passed, and Ethan was still out on the streets at 45 years old. The only comfort and true friend for the homeless man was his dog, Buddy. Ethan took him in as a blind puppy when he found him struggling helplessly in a pile of empty cardboard boxes. When he heard the familiar squeaking of a puppy, the man bent down and took the small thing into his arms. The puppy started gnawing at Ethan's finger, and he understood that he was very hungry. Despite having very little money, Ethan sacrificed what very little he had to buy a bag of milk and a small bun. Ethan then poured the appetizing liquid into an empty cup and crumbled the bun into it. The puppy quickly devoured the treat. That's when Ethan decided that he was going to keep the puppy. Though the man couldn't speak, he called the puppy Buddy in his mind. Over time, the puppy grew into a strong, athletic dog, attracting looks from passersby on the street. Buddy understood Ethan even without words. All the man had to do to give the dog a command was look him in the eyes. And so, there they were, the mute homeless man and his dog, who loved him more than life itself. One day, when Ethan was crossing the street, Buddy unexpectedly launched forward. Ethan had no time to realize what was happening before a sporty Chevrolet turned the corner and speeded towards the intersection. Hit by the drunk driver, Buddy met his fate almost instantly. The car drove away, having barely slowed down. Ethan only heard the impact and the high-pitched sound his pet made. At that moment, Ethan's world fell apart. With no care for the oncoming traffic, Ethan rushed to his dog and took him into his arms. But Buddy's body was already seizing, and his eyes were covered with a deathly veil. That day, Ethan experienced the worst grief he had ever known. He buried Buddy on the outskirts of the town, with a perfect view of Buddy's favorite wasteland. Ethan soon fell into a terrible depression, which he couldn't get out of on his own. Buddy hadn't just been a dog to him, he was his only friend in the world. That's why, fed up with life, Ethan decided to write up a farewell will. Ethan understood very well that he couldn't pass down anything to anyone. What could a homeless mute orphan even have to pass down? But Ethan didn't think so narrowly. He made a handwritten will and headed to the notary public. Ethan's appearance was hardly suitable for visiting public offices, but he didn't feel embarrassed. When Ethan came to the notary's office, the last thing on his mind was formality. The guard at the entrance looked at him with disdain, but then pretended not to notice him. He seemed to not want to get involved with the homeless person, especially since the guard was on bad terms with the female notary worker. So he chose to spite her in his own way. Jessica Mitchell had been working in the notary's office for over 15 years, and she had long gotten used to the eccentric clients that came by along with their extravagant behavior. But when the homeless man entered the office with a piece of paper in his hands, the woman felt an unpleasant chill go down her back. "Are you here to see me?" Jessica asked, stammering on every word. The woman notary worker had recently turned 45 and was going through a failed marriage complicated by painful divorce. The reason for the divorce was the claim of her husband that Jessica was infertile. Unwilling to undergo medical examinations, He accused Jessica of infertility and ran off with a young lover. Jessica was cheated on and took the divorce hard. She felt abandoned and unwanted. When Ethan silently handed Jessica the piece of paper with a handwritten will on it, she could hardly contain her surprise. After a quick glance at what had been written, she covered her eyes with her hands and wept silently. In his will, Ethan went on in depth on his difficult life. He included everything from his childhood in the orphanage to Pamela's deception, and even Buddy's tragic death. At the end, Ethan went on to state that he'd like his body to be donated to science and his organs to be used to help others. Goodness, I can't even begin to imagine what you must be going through, Jessica whispered, turning to her mute client. She knew deep down that Ethan was telling the truth, because he had tears in his eyes and an unspeakable anguish painted all over him. Jessica took Ethan by the hand and tried to calm him down. "Don't worry, Mr. Rodgers. Don't be so quick to die, please. Live a little longer, and I'll do my part to try to help you in any way I can," the notary worker added. Hearing Miss Mitchell's words, Ethan looked up at her and wept silently. With the lifetime he had spent on the street, Ethan had grown so used to the humiliation and the abuse that he couldn't believe that a stranger would want to help him. To Jessica Mitchell's credit, she really did keep her word, and she did everything in her power to help Ethan. For starters, she helped Ethan recover his lost documents and get a job. Meanwhile, she also helped him out financially, knowing full well that he didn't have a penny to his name. It's hard to say what exactly Jessica saw in Ethan's eyes. Most likely, the woman experienced a rush of tenderness and sympathy, which can happen with people in moments of spiritual loneliness. While helping Ethan, Jessica almost didn't notice herself falling in love with the silent, brutal, and handsome man who had changed a lot since he first started living a normal life. Jessica's feelings were soon reciprocated when Ethan, for the first time in years, realized he was in love. At first, Jessica's friends were rather cynical of her silent companion. However, when Ethan decided to get a university degree, they changed their opinion for the better. The climax of the couple's relationship came when the news arrived of Jessica's pregnancy. It turned out that she wasn't so infertile after all. Jessica had experienced a miracle that many across the world could only dream about. The couple got their happiness and held a grand wedding, proving to everyone in attendance that life really can begin at the age of 45.